Hi, this is John Goodman. So this webcast is a little bit unusual in that it is very much focused for viewing by Colorado real estate brokers. If you are not a Colorado real estate broker, this will not have much use to you, and I encourage you to stop watching and go down the list and watch another video. All right, for Colorado real estate brokers, here's what we're talking about. This video is being recorded in February of 2017, and one of the things that's new in February 2017 is your regulator, the Colorado Division of Real Estate, has come out with a new version of the earnest money release form. It has a significant change in it, which could rock your life here, good and bad. So in order for me to give you a sense of the change, you need to have an understanding of how things were before this change occurred. So there's a concept, we're talking about the earnest money release form, and for whatever reason, the contract has terminated. And in most situations, when a contract terminates, the buyer is entitled to get all of the earnest money back that was being held in escrow. And so in the old version of the form, the one side or another would fill out the form calling for all of the, let's say, $10,000 of earnest money to be refunded back to the buyer. And the buyer and seller would both sign off on that earnest money release form. And the parties would be done with each other. The contract was terminated and both sides would be released of all liability to each other, subject to certain kind of intuitive exceptions that aren't worth going into in this video. The point is that the signing of the old earnest money release form meant that the parties were finished with each other. Now, in the new version of the form, the Division of Real Estate has added a checkbox. And if the box is checked, then the form works just like the old version of the form. In fact, I don't think I've ever done this in a video, but let me do it right now. I'm going to read to you just a sentence here. It says, this is in section 3, if this box is checked, the parties mutually release each other from any and all claims, demands, obligations, and claims related to the contract or the property, subject to certain intuitive exceptions that I'm not going to get into in this broadcast. So if the box is checked, you're essentially under the old system, the pre-2017 system. What's different? What if the box is not checked? I've got to read to you again. If the box is not checked, the parties do not release each other. So why did the Division of Real Estate do this? Well, there's some situations where, for example, I'm giving you an example, the buyer wants to get the buyer's earnest money back as quickly as possible so that the buyer can move on, reduce the buyer's damages from a seller default, and then pursue another alternative. But the buyer still wants to preserve the buyer's ability to go after the seller for the buyer's damages. Let me give you an example. Suppose the buyer puts a property under contract on day 0. The transaction is supposed to close on day 30. The buyer marches along towards the closing, does all their due diligence, spends money on inspection, spends money on an appraisal, is excited, locks in a mover, is ready to move in, and 3 days before closing, you, the broker working with the buyer, receives a call from the listing broker. Hey, buyer's broker, I'm the listing broker. I hate to be the bearer of bad news. I'm as disappointed by this as you are, but my seller has decided not to perform on the contract. Now, some percentage of your buyers will be inclined to dig in their heels. Some percentage of your buyers will do things like hire their own lawyer and go after the seller for breach of contract. But some percentage of your buyers will not want to do that. Some percentage of your buyers will say, look, I can't wait around for the law to take care of me in this contract. And they will say to you, broker, remember, they're talking to you, you're the buyer's broker in this story, get me my earnest money back as quickly as possible, but I also want to preserve my flexibility after I get my earnest money back to continue to pursue the seller for damages that I might have. Because the buyer might have damages. Getting the earnest money back may not make the buyer whole. The buyer has hard costs for that inspection, for that appraisal. The buyer may have cancellation fees. The buyer may need to find short-term place to live. And as I record this video, we don't know if we are in a increasing interest rate environment, but if the buyer has to go back out to the market and buy another replacement house and spend more money buying that replacement house, and if the buyer has to get a new loan and that new loan has an interest rate that's higher than the interest rate that the buyer had on the loan that the buyer was going to use to buy the house where the seller has defaulted, the buyer could have big damages. So that's why the Division of Real Estate created this checkbox system. In a situation like that, you would leave the box unchecked. Hopefully, the seller would sign off on the earnest money release. The buyer gets the $10,000 earnest money back. And then the buyer lawyers up and decides whether to go after the seller for damages beyond getting the $10,000. All right, why am I telling you about this? One is that one of the concerns I have, and I have to have some humility, or at least I have to fake it that I have some humility, that one of the things that may come up here is there may be situations where you, working with the buyer, complete the form, leave the box unchecked, it's submitted to the listing broker, it's submitted to the seller, and while the seller doesn't have any problem getting the earnest money back to the buyer, the seller wants a complete release and refuses to sign because the seller has not received the complete release. So all of a sudden we have the earnest money frozen, even though there isn't really any skirmish, there isn't any disagreement that the buyer should get the $10,000 earnest money back. Also, another scenario that I'm concerned about is sometimes it's not unusual in a situation like this for the seller to agree to reimburse the buyer in the earnest money release form for the buyer's hard costs. In other words, you can imagine a sentence being added to the form. In addition to refunding the earnest money, the seller will pay buyer for, $700, $400 for the appraisal, and $300 for the inspection, just as examples. If the box is checked, then one of the things that the seller receives in exchange for signing off on that earnest money release form is in exchange for paying the $700 to the buyer, the seller receives back a release. But if the box is not checked, the seller doesn't receive anything back. And the way lawyers say that is the seller doesn't receive any consideration. In other words, there isn't consideration supporting the seller's obligation to pay the $700, and that might create a challenge for the buyer actually enforcing the seller's obligation to pay the buyer $700. Something for buyers and sellers to talk to their lawyers about. We'll see how this mischief may unfold. I'm not suggesting that this is a bad change. The question will be whether the positives outweigh the negatives. If there are any negatives at all, stay tuned. And in the meantime, remember my tagline. We live in a complex world. Be careful out there. Thanks for watching.